There's been this idea rattling around in my brain lately. It's not new. In fact, I've talked about variations of it before, and I know that I've had many conversations about it in real life while complaining about traffic in Northern Virginia. So several years ago, I brought up this idea of tactical minimalism, and my intent was showcasing the benefits of focusing on fewer things executed really well. And that could be something like practicing only a handful of marksmanship positions to the point of mastery, or picking one physical capability to prioritize at a time, or focusing only on a few big hitter weapon manipulation techniques like reloads or malfunctions. In short, the goal was minimizing multitasking. In the years since that post, I've lived a bit more life, made a few more observations, and taken away a few more hard lessons. And it's led me to the conclusion that most people are really struggling to make progress on their goals because they are saddled with too many options. So today we're going to talk about that. Welcome to the Everyday Marksman. I am your host, Matt Robertson, the podcast where it's all about, you know what, we're going to change the tagline today because I'm thinking about the future. It's all about becoming resolute. Our website is everydaymarksman.co. There you'll find today's show notes, as well as links to all of our social media, our awesome community of marksmen. Make sure you join up with that email list so I can send you new things as they come out. So let's get back to the point of today. It starts with traffic and ends with brain rot. So this starts with an observation that I made several years ago. I believe the skill of the average driver on the road today is steadily decreasing. Sure, I'll accept that widespread saturation of devices and phones that constantly distract drivers is a problem, and I'm guilty of that too, but only at stoplights. But it actually fits right into what I think about with having too many options of things to do. It seems to me that decreasing skill and safety habits have declined right alongside the number of cars equipped with all sorts of driver assistance features. Things like automatic braking, lane departure, lane centering, automatic parking, traffic detection, self-driving modes, and more. Each of these advancements is incredible in their own right, and they should make roads safer overall. The problem is that all of these features were supposed to work in conjunction with a capable driver. Paired together, a good driver backed up with great safety capabilities makes an even better driver. Instead, we saw drivers decide that they didn't need to worry about it anymore. So rather than using technology as an assistant, they use it as a crutch. Think of how many people no longer visually check their blind spots before backing out of a spot or changing lanes, relying on the car to tell them, hey, something's in the way. It even comes down to people's memory. How many people no longer build mental maps of the cities and neighborhoods they live in and just rely on GPS navigation to get them around? Another example happened in the military side of it. So optics like ACOGs and red dot sights really grew in popularity during the global war on terror, the GWOT era. So the idea here was, given a certain level of marksmanship skill and practice, you could take a shooter to a next level. You can make them make faster hits. They can make better identification and be more accurate. But that's not what actually ended up happening. What ended up happening was, as these new capabilities rolled in and every rifle was equipped with optics, magnified, or a red dot, they just put less time and money into practicing actual marksmanship. The net result was that the average performance stayed about the same. So I think there's a really strong argument here that the average military shooter today is worse than they were 20, 30 years ago because they have newer, better tools that just make up the difference for them. That's not how it was supposed to work. I dug into some other numbers too. In the early 1990s, the NYPD, New York Police Department, released a short report, which I have linked to in the show notes, about the adoption of semi-automatic pistols to replace their classic .38 caliber revolvers. One of the findings was, in the first year after issuing the semi-auto pistols, the average number of shots fired by an officer went from below 4 to 10.7 shots per incident. Now, keep in mind that these were semi-autos, early ones. They were probably, 10, 15 rounds a magazine. I would bet that this has actually gotten worse over time. I had an interview recently, which I'll release in the next couple of weeks to months, where someone who is a police officer basically joked that the average number of shots fired in a police shootout is the number of rounds in the magazine. So I just kind of empty it. But what's notable is that the actual hit rate didn't really significantly change with it. In another study, 2008, RAND highlighted that NYPD hits between 1998 and 2006 hovered between 15% and 30%, depending on whether or not the suspect fired back. Now compare that to another data set, again from the NYPD, showing the hit rate between 1976 and 1988, the revolver era, was around 27% to 30%. So they were, on average, more accurate. Doing some back-of-the-napkin math on that, a hit rate of 15% on an average shots fired of 10.9 means that 1.6 shots hit the target. All right, that's the semi-auto, so 1.6 shots per hit the target per incident out of nearly 11 shots fired. Comparing to the revolver era, a 30% hit out of 4 shots is 1.2 on target. So, in reality, they didn't actually hit the target any more frequently than they did before, but they definitely did put a lot more shots into the surrounding area and potential bystanders. 9.2 for semi-autos versus 2.8 for revolvers. Now, Daryl Bulkey, who runs American Fighting Revolver, mentioned this phenomenon in several podcasts I was listening to leading up to this. And prior to the widespread adoption of semi-auto pistols, police officers had a higher standard of training and performance expectations precisely because they knew they had fewer rounds available and reloads were going to be slow. The switch to semi-auto pistols coincided with a decrease in marksmanship standard because officers knew they could allow themselves to miss more shots. I don't know about you, but that sounds scary, but it's very much related to this idea of, driver safety features and making people less safe drivers. This also applies to things like physical training. Another area that I see is that we're inundated with options, so many options that it becomes more and more difficult to simply get started doing anything. There's an entire world out there of fitness influencers and coaches selling you on whatever their approach is. The barbell-focused guys from Starting Strength School get in arguments with the machine-based bodybuilding guys. And then on the side, the hybrid athletes battle out with the kettlebell guys, all watch from sidelines, and everybody thinks they're right and will sell you absolutely on their approach. And the awkward truth is that getting stronger and more physically fit is not some great mystery. Humans have done it for literally thousands of years, following the same basic principles that underlie it today. So what changed? We have more options. When our ancestors did it, they only had stones, heavy sacks of whatever, and wrestling with their peers. There's only so many things you can do with that, so they focus on getting as capable as possible with the minimal tools that they had. Today, the options for equipment and programming styles are practically infinite. So many options make people worry that they're choosing the wrong one, and they're fearful that if they're going to miss out on some mythical path to progress that they could have had if only they'd made a different decision. But they're wrong. Because we have to realize that options are not shortcuts. So what do I think really happened? Even if it's not the polite way to say it. People are lazy. The availability of so many options make us believe deep down that if we only pick the right combination of them, then we can shortcut past this whole long plod to proficiency. How many other places have you seen this exact behavior? It's literally everywhere. Forums and social media are full of beginners who buy the latest, best piece of gear, hoping it will help them accelerate through or even avoid the grind of practice and making mistakes. I'm certainly guilty of this as well from time to time. It's a big slice of humble pie to realize that eventually the only way you're gonna improve and make significant progress is to dial back the complexity of what you're doing and focus on a few core fundamentals to the point of absolute mastery. And then those things are what's gonna carry you forward. The hard part about this is accepting that those basics could have been done with any reliable tool from the very beginning. Everything else is essentially fanning your ego. So I've been thinking about this idea for a while, and I've heard it in several places. The most recent one being a couple of years ago, I interviewed Paul Horn about strength training, and he had something he called the bell curve. And he shared a story about being a session drummer for music recordings when he lived in Los Angeles. And he shared an insight that my wife, who's also a professional musician, used to talk about with her students. I want you to imagine a bell curve. Beginners are on the far left, and they practice the basics because that's all they know how to do. Doing the same basic things over and over again, like practicing scales in music, is boring. Doing things like your basic dry fire in your basement, your garage, your living room, wherever, to just practice the same draw stroke over and over again is boring. Standing there with your rifle slung on your shoulder, practicing your standing position facing the mirror, like John Simpson suggested way back in like episode 2, is boring. They aren't all that motivated to do it. So as soon as they are able to move on to doing more interesting things, they do. The middle of the curve is the intermediates. And the intermediates overcomplicate everything, right? As they learn new tricks, they want to show off what they know so they can better separate themselves from beginners, that they can go into a message board or social media or go to the range or go to a music store or whatever, and then start playing things to show off all their cool tricks to show that, look, I'm not a beginner anymore. I know what I'm doing, right? We all know people like this, including ourselves. Let's be honest. With music, this is the people who want to break into solos and show off all the complex finger techniques and go at way too fast of a pace. With fitness, it's the desire to try every variation of exercise to find the so-called optimal method of making progress. And in shooting, it's the guys who buy ever more expensive gear and experiment with all the niche little cartridges while putting on range theatrics. Many people will forever stay intermediates, never really making progress on anything, but happily adding more tricks to the repertoire so that they feel like they're getting better. But they're not. On the far end of the curve, the far right side of the curve, you have the true masters. Now, this group no longer feels a need to prove themselves, and instead they focus on executing the basics to such a degree that the world can recognize their mastery. Think of musicians who can play basic scales with such precision and musicality that it would bring tears to your eyes. Several years ago, when I attended a small unit training at Max Velocity Tactical, I distinctly remember Max talking about the way the Special Forces guys trained at the facility. He had an interesting perspective because he was a ranger, not ranger. He was a para regiment from the British Army, which is kind of their equivalent of our Rangers in the U.S. He trained civilians of different levels, and he even had Special Forces and high-level units come to his facility. So he's kind of been there, done that, seen it all. And I remember him talking about it, and they did the exact same drills that we were doing as beginners, but they executed them with such expert, swift coordination and aggression honed from years of practicing those same drills together as a team. He showed us a video of this happening, pointing out what they were doing, and one of the students said, "That's it? Well, we could do that." And remember Max looking at this guy and saying, "But you didn't." And that's the difference. So how does this affect things like what you're going to choose as equipment? Because I think there's an overlap here. Way back in 2019, one of my first interviews for this podcast was with Justin from Revolver Guy. And during that talk, he discussed a similar kind of bell curve that he adopted from Caleb Giddings. Revolvers, as he saw it, had a utility curve where they were appealing and useful to shooters at the beginning and the end of the curve. Beginners were served well by a weapon that required only that they pull the trigger. Revolvers do not suffer many of the shooter mechanics issues that affect autoloaders. Things like, if your wrist isn't firm enough or shooting from a confined space that might prevent the slide from operating properly, right? They're less useful for intermediate shooters who want to compete, shoot a lot, go to training courses, burn a lot of ammo, and engage in that gear race. And then at the far end of the bell curve, back into that expert area, they become useful again for people who put way more emphasis on simple, good marksmanship and avoiding bad situations in the first place. To mention Daryl Bulkey again, he says it's a get out of trouble gun, not a I'm going into trouble gun. So let's wrap this up. The message here is the same one I've been saying for a long time. The vast majority of readers and listeners to the Everyday Marksman are not professional shooters who live and breathe this stuff every day. We do not have the benefit of time, training, and ammunition paid for by other people's money. As such, every commitment of time and money should mean something and push our capability in some meaningful way. And to get the absolute best bang for our commitments, we should focus on doing fewer things extraordinarily well. And I'm all for buying things for fun. Don't get me wrong, fun is allowed. But meaningful progress comes from excellent execution of the basics. All we really need is a reliable tool and a method to support our goals. Everything else begins dipping into edge cases and personal preferences at best, or engaging in social media ego fluffing at worst. It makes no sense to invest thousands upon thousands of dollars to build the perfect precision rifle when you are unable to hit an 8 MOA target at 600 yards. Even worse, it makes little sense to focus on that 600-yard range when you never actually get to shoot anything beyond 100 to 200 yards because you don't have facilities or even sight lines. So here it is. I'm telling you to stay disciplined with your commitments. Spend 80% of your time and money focus on perfectly executing the basics of whatever your chosen task is. It could be shooting, fitness, music, radio skill, whatever. Have a simple system to progress those basics and hold yourself to consistent practice a few times a week or more. This is every bit as much of a mental challenge to be satisfied with boring, but I promise you that it will pay off in the end. So that's all I've got today. Thanks for listening. Excited times ahead. It's 2026. I've got a lot going on behind the scenes. We're going to be shifting things around the website a little bit, maybe change up the podcast. So stay tuned for some upcoming changes. I'm glad you're here. Once again, come by the website, everydaymarksman.co. Make sure you sign up for the email list, and I look forward to telling you more about it. Take care.